Imagine waking up and discovering your entire town could disappear by the end of the month. In the middle of the 14th century, a microscopic bacteria brought the medieval world to its knees. Yet, the deadliest pandemic in human history accidentally cracked open a stagnant economic system and paved the way for the modern world. Before the plague arrived, the High Middle Ages were in full swing. Europe had experienced a massive population boom, fueled by an unusually warm climate and plentiful crops. The Silk Road and maritime routes connected the East and the West, bringing glorious exotic goods into bustling trade hubs like Venice. But that macro-level wealth did not trickle down. The vast majority of the population were peasants, trapped in the rigid, oppressive system of feudalism. You worked the local lord's land, handed over a huge cut of your harvest, and barely managed to survive. The economic trap was simple: overpopulation. The supply of workers was so massive that human labor was practically worthless. If a peasant complained about their conditions, a lord could immediately kick them out and replace them with a dozen starving people waiting in line. Feudal lords held absolute power, while roughly 90% of the population was trapped at the bottom. The system was locked from the inside, offering no path for upward mobility. It would take an overwhelming external force to shatter it. That force arrived at the Crimean Peninsula. A massive Mongol army from the Golden Horde had laid siege to a Genoese trading post called Kaffa. But the siege suddenly ground to a halt as Mongol soldiers started dropping dead from a mysterious, rapid illness. Furious that his men were dying and his siege was failing, the Mongol commander ordered troops to load rotting corpses of infected soldiers onto catapults, launching the diseased bodies directly over the city walls. Panic took over Kaffa. Horrified Genoese merchants sprinted to their galleys and set sail for Italy to escape the nightmare. They had no idea they were bringing the sickness with them. Deep in the dark holes of their ships, infected fleas were feasting on the rat population. In October 1347, these death ships arrived here, at the port of Messina in Sicily. Expecting exotic goods, the locals instead found a horror scene. Most of the sailors were already dead at their oars, and the survivors were covered in oozing black boils. The port authorities ordered the gust ships out of the harbor, but the ropes were already tied to the docks. The rats scurried down the mooring lines and directly into the bustling city. From Messina, the spread was unstoppable. By hitching a ride on the merchant ships of the Mediterranean, a microscopic bacteria perfectly hijacked the newly built engines of globalization to transform a localized outbreak into a continent-wide apocalypse. When the disease hit a town, the physical decline was brutal. Victims of the Bubonic strain developed egg-sized, incredibly painful swellings in their lymph nodes called buboes. Soon after, their skin would literally turn black as the tissue died from the inside out. If you caught the pneumonic or septicemic versions, you could feel fine at night and be dead by morning. Nobody in the 14th century knew what bacteria or flea vectors were. They blamed the sickness on an unfortunate alignment of the planets, or on miasma, a widespread belief that disease was caused by breathing in bad, corrupted air. The sheer terror of the infection rate overrode basic human instincts. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Husbands abandoned their sick wives. In the most desperate attempts to survive, parents locked their doors and left their own symptomatic children out in the streets. The volume of bodies created an impossible logistical nightmare. City graveyards filled to capacity within weeks. Local governments were forced to dig deep trenches just outside the city walls, tossing carts of bodies into mass graves and layering them with dirt like lasagna. As the death toll climbed, the core structures of human empathy evaporated. Parents abandoned symptomatic children, and neighbors locked their doors against one another, trading communal bonds for a desperate, singular focus on survival. Desperate for a cure, people turned to the highly educated, incredibly expensive medical establishment. But medieval doctors offered nothing but absurdity. They prescribed glasses of crushed emeralds, drained half a patient's blood with leeches, and instructed people to sit in raw sewage, hoping the bad smell would cancel out the disease. The religious system also failed its ultimate stress test. Terrified priests and monks refused to visit the dying to administer the last rites. because medieval citizens genuinely believed that dying without these rites meant burning in purgatory forever, the cowardly clergy added massive spiritual trauma to the physical agony. Believing this was a literal punishment from God, groups of extreme religious zealots, known as the flagellants, formed. They marched in massive processions from town to town, violently whipping their own backs with metal-tipped leather straps in a bloody, futile attempt to appease divine wrath. This intense paranoia drove society into mass hysteria. Terrified people desperately wanted someone to blame. Angry mobs began looking at minority groups, insanely accusing Jewish communities across Europe of deliberately poisoning the city wells to cause the plague. Even the highest authority in the land tried to intervene. Pope Clement VI explicitly issued official papal bulls demanding a stop to the massacres, pointing out that Jewish people were dying of the exact same plague at the exact same rate. But the frenzied public ignored him, burning entire communities alive. The doctors offered useless poison. The priests abandoned the dying. The highest rulers were ignored. This collective failure shattered the average citizen's faith in medieval institutions, leaving behind an ideological vacuum. By the 1350s, the plague burned out, lacking vulnerable hosts. 50 million people were gone, half of Europe's population. On a micro level, villages became ghost towns, and centuries of farmland disappeared under thick weeds. But if you were a dirt-poor peasant who miraculously survived, you woke up to a world with a severe labor shortage. The crops were rotting in the fields, and the lords desperately needed workers. Because hands were suddenly so scarce, the lowest class acquired immense leverage. Wages skyrocketed overnight. Decades of peaceful living could not improve the conditions of the working class. It required the raw power of a pandemic to break the monopoly of the feudal lords and forcefully drive the value of human labor upward. The governments tried to stop this. England outlawed higher wages. France aggressively taxed peasants. But the survivors revolted, demanding freedom. If a local lord refused to pay a peasant what they wanted, the peasant would pack up and walk to the next town over, where a more desperate lord would happily pay double the rate. With fewer people competing for resources, there was an abundance of food and land. The wealth that had previously been concentrated at the very top finally spread out, leading to the rise of a powerful middle class of skilled artisans and independent merchants. This new middle class had the disposable income to patronize independent artists and thinkers. Because the old guard had failed to stop the plague, people began looking beyond ancient religious texts for answers, funding the scientific inquiry and human-centric art that would define the Renaissance. The Black Death was a horrific reset button on human civilization. It demonstrated how fragile our society is when faced with the raw power of nature. Yet it also proved our capacity to endure tragedy and rebuild a more advanced world out of the ashes.